I'm pleased to welcome to the program today Marianne Williamson. She is now a candidate for chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee and a former presidential candidate, and of course, an author as well. Marianne, it's really good to have you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always nice to talk to you.
Of course. I want to begin with kind of what you were doing and then what you're doing now, because I think your story running for president in a presidential primary against an incumbent president and then not essentially logistically being able to win because of some of the guardrails that were put in place by the DNC. I think a lot of people now are looking at your story and naturally wanting you to be chair of the DNC because you can kind of help adjust kind of the rules and regulations so that people are able to do what you attempted to do in 2024. Is that kind of what your main agenda is going to be as you seek to become the next chair of the DNC?
You articulated it perfectly. Thank you. And I acknowledge you for seeing it so clearly, and I thank you for saying it. I want 2028 to be a structure that allows for whoever has great ideas to have their shot at the Democratic nomination. And that's how I feel we're going to win in 2028. And I feel, just as you said, that my experience gives me some insight into some of the changes that are needed.
Yeah, and I mean, I think more candidates is certainly always a better thing or more choice for people as well. For people, I guess, who are
Democracy.
watching, totally, exactly. For people who are watching, though, who perhaps are not as familiar with the actual role itself, chairperson of the DNC, maybe just articulate that a little bit for us. And then specifically, what maybe the previous leadership failed to do that ultimately resulted in a loss in the 2024 election.
Well, it's very interesting because the role of the DNC, technically it's the governing arm of the Democratic Party, but the role of the party is very different depending on whether or not the Democrats have the White House and other positions of power in Congress. If the Democrats have the White House, you've got the hugest possible megaphone. If the Democrats have the Speaker of the House, you have the hugest possible megaphone. If you have the Democrats in charge of the Senate, then the Senate leader has the biggest possible megaphone. We don't have any of those in the season coming up. So the DNC is the de facto megaphone for the Democratic Party. Now, all of the expertise that other people running for this office represent, having to do with data analysis, having to do with in the weeds activating of voters, everything that has to do with fundraising, all of that kind of expertise is important. It needs to be done. And the Democratic Party has the people who know how to do it. There's no question about that. But I believe that what needs to happen now, first of all, there's what you've already referred to, which is the Democratic Party needs to remember its mission, and that is that the party traditionally stands in the back. The voters decide. I mean, we're not going to save democracy if we're not practicing it in our own house, right? And so standing back, allowing the voters to decide who the candidate will be is extremely important. So that needs to shift back to what is righteous and pure and ethical and true, right? Beyond that, however, I feel now we have a task at the DNC, not only because of what I already mentioned, we don't have the White House, we don't have the House, we don't have the Senate, but also just because of the nature of the times in which we live. Donald Trump has ushered in an age of political theater, and we won't be going back. He's a uniquely 21st century political phenomenon. We need to become a phenomenon as well. The DNC tends to work off of what is basically a 20th century organizational playbook. It's very corporate. It's very technocratic. You're not going to beat Donald Trump without a little magic. If we are not going to, if Donald Trump is a phenomenon, and we need to become a phenomenon. We need to meet him on his level of emotional and psychological frequency, the influence. I always refer to the collective adrenaline rush that he's created among the American people. And that's what I would help happen were I to be a DNC chair, being out in the country, talking to people, articulating the essentially moral vision of the Democratic Party, which I believe is based on the moral vision of the Declaration of Independence. We've got to reconnect the American heart with the Democratic Party in a way it was when I was younger. It used to be that no matter what, knew that the Democratic Party was the party working for the people. And for the most part, the working people of the United States felt like the Democratic Party has my back. That's no longer necessarily true. And we've got to repair those frayed bonds of affection, and we need to do it quickly.
And I guess what kind of specific either rules or regulations perhaps were in place that prevented you from kind of reaching your potential in the 2024 primary that as chair of the DNC you would have the ability or the authority to kind of change or adjust?
It's hard to know who among them was making those ultimate decisions. That's a little opaque. But we do know this. The established party line was uh, basically there would be no primary.
Hmm.
That the party saw as its mission, and that was overtly stated, that the party saw as its mission the renomination of President Trump, President Biden. Now, I'm old enough, and the canard was put out there that, oh, we don't primary a sitting president. Well, sorry guys, I'm old enough to remember when Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy Sr. primaried Lyndon Johnson. Not only that, but I remember why it was so important. They did so in protest of the Vietnam War. Their running against him made him drop out. Now, some people say, yeah, but that's why we can't do it because then Humphrey lost. Excuse me, Bobby Kennedy Sr. was assassinated. And that made all the difference. So this idea that we don't primary incumbents, we primary in this country incumbent senators, congresspeople, mayors all the time. And there's no reason why we wouldn't primary. So that's the kind of compromise with the ethical standards and the democratic values of the party, which I would not tolerate and would not happen if I were chairman of the DNC.
And a lot of people kind of referring to the loss of Kamala Harris on November 5th, going into that election, people thought anyways, I mean, if you told me or anyone else in 2020 that Donald Trump was going to run again and then be successful in 2024, a lot of people would have looked at you as if you were crazy. Whereas the election ended up going his way, obviously. How much of that is, the fault of the campaign, in other words, out of the hands of the DNC versus how much of it was, the fault of those at the top, the chairperson of the DNC at the time, et cetera?
I think it's a bigger picture than that. It's the fault of the Democratic Party. I don't think laying the blame on this person or that particular aspect of the party is going to help us. It's a larger picture than that. To me, the Democratic Party created a big fat hole, and Donald Trump walked into it. And if it hadn't been Donald Trump, it would have been someone else. It's been years now that the Democratic Party has been willing to tolerate a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% of the American people. There are wonderful Democrats out there in the House, the Senate, governors, state legislators who work hard to promote the democratic values that I grew up with and always saw as the core identity of the Democratic Party, the sort of Rooseveltian ideal that the tools of government can be used to help people, to actualize the value that all men are given by God, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Over the last few years, there's been this kind of aberrational chapter of the Democratic Party's existence where it's kind of trying to have it both ways. Yeah, we stand for those things, and we need the insurance company donations. We need the pharmaceutical company donations, and big food, and big chemical companies, and big ag, and not gun manufacturers. You can't pin that one on the Democrats, and big oil, and defense contractors. And you can't have it both ways. So as soon as the Democratic Party started taking the corporate money back in the 1970s, that is really, that was the point at which there began to be this decline in moral authority and in what Martin Luther King would call cosmic companionship. That's when your magic started leaking out like water out of the bottom of a boat.
And what about, I mean, this might be more of a campaign thing, but like if we look at how funds were allocated over the course of the 2024 campaign, and then you think about the fact that right now, for example, the Harris campaign was $20 million in debt because they were paying, people like Oprah and Beyonce and what have you to do campaign speeches for them over the course of the election. how much of the kind of fundraising component is the DNC responsible for? And I'm asking that because you have people now like Lindy Lee as an example, who's a longtime Democrat organizer, who is saying that the party was misinforming all of the people around them that they were going to be successful in 2024. And that was kind of their fundraising pitch. And then, of course, it ended up going the complete opposite way.
Okay, I have a couple of things to say. First of all, I can't let the moment pass. Uh, I have known Oprah Winfrey for many years, and I feel that her ethics are impeccable. So
Right.
when Oprah says that the money she got went to pay for the production and to pay her people, I agree with her. Oprah Winfrey has so
Totally.
much money; she doesn't need to take $1 million from.
Right. Yeah.
So I wanted to say that. Also about
Yeah.
Lindy Lee, let's be very clear. After I announced Lindy Lee was one of the shills for the Democratic National Committee establishment that went on television and said, "Oh, we should just ignore her." And I remember when she said that, she was obviously miffed that I was running. And I remember thinking, well, good luck. You can't just ignore an FEC registered qualified candidate. And then that's exactly what they did. That was exactly the playbook. So Lindy Lee comes with her own set of prejudices, and they seem to be whatever would, suit her own career at that moment. Um, Clearly, we've all seen uh, the ridiculousness of not only the expenditure of money in that campaign, but just some of the decisions. Like you said no to Joe Rogan. You
Yeah.
you did what now? And then you told Joe Rogan he has to come to you when everybody in America knows his set is part of the whole thing.
Right. Which
You're
is saying
telling
no to millions
Joe,
of people, basically.
yes, and you're saying that you only talked to him for 30 minutes, or you said to the
Yeah.
Teamsters, you'll only answer 3 of 16 questions. Why? You walked out of the meeting and said, we're going to win with you or without you. Why? And you didn't expect them to then not endorse. I mean, I don't, on a personal level, let's not kick the woman when she's down. This has got to be a very difficult moment. But in terms of our analyzing the mistakes of a campaign, but I think my point, however, is it's so much bigger than that campaign. The absurdity of the mistakes in that campaign, to me, were just a continuation of the absurdity of things that have been happening really for decades now.
And so, like, moving forward, because Donald Trump is obviously he can't run anymore as per the Constitution, but the movement that he's created is more of like a mega style movement. And I mean, you're shaking your hands in the sense of maybe the Constitution could be changed. That's obviously a big if, but
That seems to
um,
be his goal.
it seems to be his goal, absolutely. But I mean, even if it's not him, it's certainly the Republican nominee in 2028 very well could be basically someone who's just an extension of him. How do the Democrats, but specifically the DNC, again, the body that you're running to chair, kind of capitalize on the time that they have? While also understanding that, again, as you said in the beginning, right now they don't have the White House, the Senate, or the House. It's going to be, in many ways, a very difficult 4 years for not just the DNC, but for Democrats kind of as a whole.
Well, everything I've been saying. First thing I think you should do is make me chairman of the DNC so that we can get out there and create an inspirational phenomenon. Like I said, he's a phenomenon. The only way we're going to counter him is by creating a phenomenon of our own. We can't just see this as how are we going to fight Donald Trump? First of all, it's very difficult to fight people who have no shame. We're going to win by inspiring the American people. First thing we have to do is make sure our own house is democratic, reclaim the principles of democracy and the traditional principles of the Democratic Party in how we operate. We have to reclaim our own traditional ideals and speak them without apology. We must be the unequivocal advocates of the working people of the United States. And we must not compromise with that vision. The second thing I would do is make sure that the American people know what's happening. One of the things that I have seen, Wyatt, is that the Republicans are very good at tending to their base.
Hmm.
They maintain and foster the relationship with their base. In any relationship, you can't take it for granted. You have to feed it. And they feed their relationship with their base. They have created a reality where millions and millions of people are made to feel like by being involved with the Republican Party and MAGA, I am participating in the American story. Well, I'm sorry that where were we that we allowed this to happen? The Democratic Party had taken on this template where vote for us every 2 years. We're going to come and say, give us your money, give us your votes. And then we're going to go into our wood paneled rooms and you're supposed to just trust that we're doing the right thing. And then we'll see you again in 2 years. So we not only need to be talking to people 365 days of a year, but we need to be asking people, what do you need from us? One of the things I will do if elected is there will be an entire infrastructure of communication. Every single day, people will know this is what Trump's doing. And this is what the Democrats are doing. This is what the Democrats are standing for in the House, in the Senate, in this state, that governor, that state legislature. This is what's happening in your state to stand for these Democratic values. It won't all be let's hate on Donald Trump. That's not the way to do this. It will be this is how we are inspiring the regeneration, the renewal, the regreening, not only of the Democratic Party, but of the United States, so that people feel the practical relevance of politics to their lives and real life ways in which they too can participate in creating the turnarounds that we all want to see happen.
And I mean, you yourself have went through now 2 presidential campaigns, and it's interesting because you're kind of articulating things that you did yourself over the course of your campaign, but yet for whatever reason, the Harris campaign, as you said, spent the majority of time over the course of the election kind of focused on Donald Trump, which I mean, you have to do to a certain extent. He's your opponent, but at the same time, I think people were kind of just wondering what they're going to do actually on some of the substantial issues, the so-called kitchen table issues that are impacting them. How do you find a balance between those two things and just, I guess, again, bringing the DNC into the mix here? How much of, the DNC is policy versus the, again, attack and offense kind of linings?
I remember I was on the Piers Morgan show and I said, stop talking about Donald Trump. By that point, everybody knows who he is. At
Mm-hmm.
that point, it was having the opposite effect. People were feeling we were too hard on poor Donald with some of the lawfare and so forth. So this idea, he's a bad guy, he's a bad guy, he's a bad guy. What was that? What good was that doing? Everybody knew who he was, and everybody knew how they felt about him. So we weren't losing voters because people didn't know who he was. A lot of people would agree with many of the worst words we could use to describe him, and they would still say, yeah, and I still think he'll be a better president. So that's number one. There was way too much time spent on that. That was almost like relitigating something that we had already lost that battle in 2016. That was number one. Number two, a lot of people now say, oh, we should have talked more about kitchen table issues. You think? First of all, if it took this devastating defeat to remind you that people are suffering out there,
Yeah.
that 1 in 4 Americans live with medical debt, that 70 to 90 million Americans are either uninsured or underinsured, that people are rationing their insulin, selling their blood plasma. It took this to remind you, yes, we should really talk about kitchen table issues. Then you do not have the fire in your belly, and you should step aside and let somebody who does take it from here. Not only that, though, I'm worried about the people who can't even afford a kitchen table. And that's the poor and the near poor in this country who are basically just brushed off by the political system because they just say, hey, they don't vote anyway. That's immoral. And that right there is undemocratic.
And just I want to conclude with this, the two values of honesty and integrity, because if you look at, again, that time period, July, August, you had people who were telling President Biden that if, he didn't step aside, that the party would not be successful. And then, of course, he did step aside, but a lot of people said it was too late. And that's the reason why Kamala Harris was not successful, because she had a very short amount of time to kind of convince people on her vision. But then even with the time that she did have, again, she didn't bring up a lot of substantial policy issues. She did, a handful of interviews. You referenced the Joe Rogan situation. But a lot of the kind of calls for Joe Biden to stay in the race was being called rather from kind of the inner workings of the DNC itself. So how do you, just again to conclude on this kind of hopefully uplifting note, how do you restore those values of honesty and integrity to the party?
Well, first of all, the lack of integrity began with the fact that they didn't have a primary where other candidates, whether myself, Bobby Kennedy, Dean Phillips, or whomever, were given a fair, or the voters were given fair exposure to us, whether it was blacklisting on legacy media channels, infiltrating our campaigns, kicking us off ballots and so forth, creating false narrative, character assassination. It's ugly stuff. But secondly of all, even when the president left, we had time. We could have had a blitz campaign.
Yeah.
We absolutely. I was saying as soon as he left, okay, I'm ready to debate Kamala. She could have debated me. She could have debated Dean. But
Yeah.
they were like, no, only insiders allowed. Only insiders are qualified. What that means is only those qualified to perpetuate the system as we already run it. That's not what America is supposed to be. That's not America. I mean, that American democracy is one in which, according to James Madison, if you were born here, if you're 35 or older, if you lived here 14 years or longer, then you can run for president and you can be president. And it's the job of the Democratic Party to honor that, not try to suppress that because it's not convenient, according to a small group.
All right, we'll leave our conversation there. Marianne Williamson, thank you so much.
Thank you. Lovely talking to you.